Hi everybody, so we're going to get started with some economics questions. My name is Jeffrey. Looking forward to working with you guys today. I've just assembled a list of commonly asked micro and macroeconomics questions from most intro courses, and we're going to go over this together and see how we get to the right answer. And then when we do that, we'll also review some of the answers that previous tutors have given and make sure those are correct as well. So with that in mind, let's just jump right in. So the first question we're working with says, which of the following is not one of the monetary policy goals of the Fed or the Federal Reserve? And we have four options in front of us. Number one, a high foreign exchange rate. Number two, high employment. Number three, economic growth. Or number four, all of the above. And so right off the bat, we know that the Fed does care about employment. Right, the Fed's job is to try and regulate the business cycle through monetary policy. And high employment is always good, right? We want low unemployment, high employment. And also economic growth, like the Fed is interested in maintaining a certain level of GDP growth every year. And so economic growth is also going to be one of those things that we're keeping an eye on. The one that stands out to us as maybe not being a direct monetary policy goal of the Fed is having a high foreign exchange rate, right? Because a high foreign exchange rate does not intrinsically entail any specific benefits to the US economy. In most cases, the foreign exchange rate of the US dollar versus other currencies is a floating exchange rate. It just is a byproduct of fluctuations in the supply of money. And so the Fed usually does not conduct monetary policy out of the goal of achieving a high foreign exchange rate. It's possible that in the process of trying to accomplish its other policy goals, the Fed intentionally or inadvertently will affect the foreign exchange rate, but I don't think it's one of those things that is a specific goal of the Fed. So that's going to be the right answer for this question. And we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer choice to make sure we're on the right track. So the previous tutor said one as well, a high foreign exchange rate, and they wrote, the Federal Reserve is the monetary authority and central bank of the United States of America that oversees the monetary policy of the economy and regulates its commercial banking system. Monetary policy refers to the actions taken by the monetary authority of the economy to control the money supply such that short-run economic fluctuations can be mitigated. The objective of the Federal Reserve is to preserve the stability of the financial system, minimize unemployment, keep prices stable by influencing the level of aggregate demand in the economy by regulating commercial banks. Maintaining a high foreign exchange rate is not part of the Fed's objectives as far as the monetary policy of the economy is concerned. The US dollar comes under a floating exchange rate regime, and hence its value is governed by how the currency trades in the foreign exchange rate market. Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Covers all the bases, and I think it's good that they included the nature of the floating exchange rate rather than a pegged or fixed exchange rate. So nothing wrong with that. We can move on to the next question. So let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, a case in which individually rational behavior leads to a jointly inefficient outcome is known as which of the following? And so this is going to go into a little bit of game theory. And game theory is an interesting setup with most well known through the Nash equilibrium or a prisoner's dilemma experiment. And so, well, not really an experiment, more like a theoretical problem. And so if for those of you who aren't familiar, we can go over a little bit of basis for prisoner's dilemma in game theory here. Prisoner's dilemma. We can look at the payoff matrix. It kind of best explains the prisoner's dilemma problem. And so with prisoner's dilemma, we're going to set up this theoretical problem where two people commit a crime and they are both caught and both are held separately and interrogated. And so we have person A as the first person and person B as the second person. And so we have these two prisoners, and they're faced each individually with two choices. They can either cooperate with the police or they can defect or betray their partner, right? And kind of, put their partner, throw the partner under the bus, essentially. And so these decisions are completely independent of the other person's decision because these two people are kept isolated. And so you have no idea what the other person is going to do, and you're faced with these two choices. Now for person A, if they choose to cooperate, or actually for either of them, if they both choose to cooperate, then they both serve 1 year in jail. On the other hand, if A chooses to cooperate and B betrays A, then A is going to serve 3 years for cooperating, and B is going to go free because he defected on person A. Meanwhile, you can flip it and say, well, if A decides to betray B and B stays silent and cooperates, then A goes free and B serves 3 years, which is more than a 1 year they would both serve if they cooperated. And finally, if they both decide to betray each other independently, then they both serve 2 years. And so this is the prisoner's dilemma setup. And the numbers don't have to be these numbers. They can be a little bit different, but the same idea will always apply. And the idea is that the optimal solution, if they were able to communicate, would be for both of them to cooperate, and then they would both serve 1 year, right? And so, oh, sorry. Is this the right numbers? Yeah, so if the ideal situation for either of them is going to look at the Nash equilibrium for what is going to happen with prisoner's dilemma, right? Looking at option A, given that you do not know whether or not the person B is going to cooperate or defect, person A can look at assuming that person B cooperates, what is the optimal choice for person A? The person A's optimal choice is obviously to cooperate, and in that sense, if B were to cooperate, in that sense, if B were to cooperate, person A's optimal choice is to defect because A would be able to go free and B would serve the time, but A would get to leave immediately. Now, assuming that person B is going to defect no matter what, then the choice between whether the choice between whether person A defects or cooperates is pretty easy for A as well. Assuming that person B is going to betray person A, then A's best bet is still to betray person B because in that sense, A would serve 2 years instead of 3 years. And so we can see no matter what happens, right, whether B is going to cooperate or B is going to defect, A's dominant strategy, choice that would make the most sense for A, is going to be this bottom row here, where A is always going to choose to defect B no matter what. Sorry about that. You can see that if we flip that for B, it's the same as well. If we assume A is going to cooperate, then B's incentives is to defect because he would rather go free than serve 1 year. And if A was going to defect, then B's incentive is still to defect because he would rather serve 2 years than 3 years. And so both people end up with this situation where they're both incentivized to defect, and they end up in this last quadrant where they both serve 2 years. That is individually rational behavior, right? A is not communicating with B in any way, and B is not communicating with A in any way, and they both end up in this Nash equilibrium outcome with both serving 2 years. That individual rational behavior, however, leads to a jointly inefficient outcome because this is not the best outcome for both people. The best outcome is for them to both serve 1 year, not 2 years. And that's the prisoner's dilemma, the fact that this individual rational behavior results in a Nash equilibrium, which is less than optimal, and kind of one of the fundamental, contact or fundamental examples of game theory. So that's going to be the kind of explanation or understanding for prisoner's dilemma or game theory or Nash equilibrium. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a game in game theory that shows why two rational individuals will fail to cooperate even when it appears that it's in their best interest to do so. This model of self-interested actions displays how two rational individuals will pursue their respective interests which occur in betraying each other, even though cooperation leads to optimally efficient outcomes for both the individuals. The fact that betraying rewards oneself and punishes the other induces individuals to betray each other to seek the reward. However, when the action is carried out collectively, the individual ends up in a jointly inefficient outcome. So I want to clarify that it's not that betraying rewards oneself and punishes the other. Necessarily, like that's true because they have both adopted strategies to defect, but the reason for this is a pretty rational. Yeah, I mean, okay, I think that's an okay way to put it. Just making sure that's a rational, that we understand it's a rational way of looking at things. It's not something that's motivated by, any like emotion or psychological like induction or anything like that. So yeah, I think this is a good answer though. So nothing wrong with that. And we can mark that as correct and move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question says, which is one way in which bonds do not generate income for investors? One says bonds appreciate in value. Two says bonds pay a specified amount at maturity. Three says that bonds pay interest, and four says bonds pay dividends. So bonds are a type of financial asset that people can invest in and put their money in. And the way it generally works is that you buy this bond and you give the bond, the debtor, you give the debtor your money, and then in exchange you receive this bond. And this bond is basically a promise of several things. First is that after a certain length of time, you will receive the principal amount of your bond back. And so if you loan somebody $1,000 and they gave you a bond, at the end of the bond's predetermined date, you will receive $1,000 back in principal. That is known as a bond reaching maturity. When the bond's predetermined time expires and you receive your principal back, that's called being a bond reaching maturity. The other question you might ask is, why would you invest in the bond if the only thing you get back is the amount of money you put in at the first place, which also has not earned any interest over that time? The answer is, well, the debtor will also provide both interest and dividend payments. And so that's going to depend on what kind of bond it is. Some of them might pay annual dividends or interest payments. Some of them might pay monthly. Some of them might pay no interest at all and give an extra amount of money or overall interest payment at maturity. So there's a lot of different ways to set up a bond. But the idea is that you're compensated for the risk you take on by buying a bond through the interest and dividend payments. And throughout all of this, bonds can also change in value based on the competing interest rates in other investments. And so a bond that promises to return you 2% in interest is going to raise in value if the interest rate drops even more below 2%, and therefore this bond is suddenly returning a much higher interest rate than other financial instruments. And so all that being said, that hopefully gives you a good understanding of what kind of financial assets bonds are. And then looking at the specific question, it says, which is one way in which bonds do not generate income for investors? And so looking down this list, all four of these things are true. Bonds do appreciate in value sometimes, and you can sell bonds prematurely to someone else and reap the value, and that could be income. Bonds do pay a specified amount of maturity. Bonds do pay interest sometimes, and bonds do pay dividends sometimes. But the correct answer here is going to be two, that bonds pay a specified amount at maturity. Not because that's not true, right? Bonds do pay back the principal amount at maturity, but the fact that principal amount does not function as income for the investor. It is simply a return of the money that the investor previously loaned to the debtor, right? And so that's the primary reason that number two is going to be correct. And so we can take a look at the previous year's answer to confirm. So the previous tutor also said too, bonds are pay a specified amount of maturity, and they rate that bonds are debt obligations or financial instruments expressing indebtedness issued by the borrower to the lender as debt security under which the issuer obliges himself or herself to pay interest to the holder of the bond or to pay the principal amount at a later date, also known as maturity date. Investors buy bonds to hold them until maturity such that profits can be earned from the interest payments. Bonds appreciate in value and pay interest. However, investors cannot generate income from bonds by the specified amount they pay at maturity. I think we want to clarify the amount paid at maturity is equivalent to the initial principal paid to the issuer, and so this would never yield positive income independent of other income flows. And so that's going to be a little bit of clarification, but overall this is going to be a good explanation of the right answer. Let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, during a business cycle expansion, total production blank and total employment blank. And so I remember that a business cycle looks something like this. Let's see if we can draw this out. So we have our overall growth rate of the economy, and then we have our short run fluctuations around this economy growth. And we have total output and time, right? And so during a business cycle expansion, we're in one of these phases where we're moving from the trough to the peak, right? So we're moving in this direction. And so we see that total production on the y-axis is definitely going to go up. We're moving through a time in which the economy is recovering from a recession or going into an economic boom, and overall production in the economy is definitely going to increase. And so we can eliminate C and D, as those say that production would decrease instead of increase. And then employment, and we know that employment is very much correlated with the growth of the economy, and so if total output or production is going up, you're going to see a corresponding increase in employment as well. And so we expect the correct answer here to be A, that during a business cycle expansion, total production increases and total employment increases. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So they also chose A. And they wrote that the business cycle, in a general sense, may be defined as rhythmic and wave-like fluctuations in aggregate employment, income, output, and price level that take place in the economy at intervals in the form of expansion or boom, recession, depression, and recovery. We can see that the business cycle as the economic cycle because of the reason that it shows the fluctuations in the economy for a particular period. In simple terms, it shows the changes in real gross domestic product. Business cycle expansion is a phase that falls in between trough and peak, where the trough is the point showing the lowest real GDP, and the peak is showing the highest real GDP. So the expansion is the stage that shows an increase in real GDP, which means both total production and total employment increase in expansion. Yeah, I think that's good. Nothing wrong with that. Good answer. And we can move on to the next question. Next question says, which of the following results in a rightward shift of the market demand curve for labor? And so here we're talking about the labor market. Remember that the labor market can seem a little bit counterintuitive to what we might first think of when we think of who would be a supply of labor, who would be a demander of labor. And so you might think that we have quantity of labor on the x-axis, we have wage on the y-axis, we have demand, and we have supply. So some people think that the suppliers of labor are going to be the employers, because employers are the ones who are hiring people, they're the ones who are supplying job openings, and then the people who demand labor are going to be the employees, because we're the ones who want to look for jobs, we're the ones who have demand for the labor that is sorry for the jobs that are available. And that's not true. The labor market is set up in a way such that the supply curve is composed of the labor force, people who are looking for a job, and there's a positive relationship between the amount of money or wages that you offer people and how much they actually end up, how many people want a job, right? If you increase your wages that you're paying, there's going to be a higher supply of labor because or higher quantity supply of labor because more people are willing to work if you pay them more money. Similarly, there's a inverse relationship between wages and the demand for labor, and demand of labor is composed by employers who are looking to hire people. And so if you say that employers must pay a very high wage, then they're not going to be able to hire that many people, and the quantity of demand for labor is going to be low. And meanwhile, if you say you can pay very low wages to your workers, then there should be a very high quantity demand of labor because people are going to be able to, employers are going to be able to employ more people if they have to pay them only a little bit of money. And so here we're talking about a situation in which we see a rightward shift of the market demand for labor. And so we know that this is going to be something that affects the ability of businesses or employers to hire people, and it's going to increase their ability to hire people or increase their incentive to hire people. So let's take a look at the possible reasons. The first reason is an increase in the wage rate. And so first, we know that an increase in the wage rate is going to decrease the quantity demanded of labor, right? The demand curve is downward sloping. And second, we know that an increase in the wage rate, any change in the wage rate has nothing to do with shifting the demand curve. The wage rate is what's on the y-axis, and therefore a change in the wage rate merely changes the a movement along the demand curve rather than a shift of the overall demand curve. So one is not going to be correct. Two says a decrease in the price of raw materials. And again, that seems to have no impact on the labor market specifically. We can think of decreasing input prices for raw materials as something that might affect the supply curve for producers overall, but has no real impact on the number of people that employers are looking to hire. So that's not going to be correct. Three says an increase in labor productivity, and this is something that would reasonably cause a rightward shift in the market demand curve, right? If you suddenly can, get higher productivity out of all the people that you hire, employers are going to be incentivized to hire more people in order to take advantage of that higher productivity. And so that's going to be something that shifts that demand curve to the right for sure. And just to make sure we're not missing another answer, let's go to 4. And it says an increase in the demand for the firm's products. And again, an increase in the demand for the firm's products merely is going to cause a change in the overall supply and demand curves of the product, not for the labor market in particular. And so 3 is going to be the right answer here, an increase in productivity. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So they also said 3. And they say a rightward shift in the market demand curve for labor will occur when the quantity demanded of labor increases at all price levels. The demand for labor is a function of wages. Increases in the wage rate will lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of labor, represented by a movement on the same curve. An increase in labor productivity, also known as labor productivity growth, will allow the firms to expand their current level of output and earn greater profits. Hence, productivity growth encourages the demand for labor, shifting the curve to a right. And so this seems to be a good example of a good explanation for why this is the right answer. Now let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, how do central banks govern the banking industry? Check all that apply. So we can go down the line and see what we think. So one says, by deciding how much banks must keep in reserve. And so we know this is something that the Fed, but central banks like the Fed definitely do. We know that this is regulated through reserve requirements. What percentage of deposits must banks keep in reserve, and the rest can be loaned out to other banks or to other consumers. And so 1 is going to be true. 2, by overseeing the nation's payment system, and again, we know that this is true. The central banks like the Fed are very involved in the payment system. They're very involved in regulating commercial banks, and so that is something that is definitely going to be marked true as well. 3 says by supervising the loan process at banks, and this is not normally seen to be true. The loan process at banks is entirely up to the commercial banks to run. The Fed is simply concerned about things like the reserve requirements or the federal funds rate or things like that. And so 3 is not going to be marked correct. 4 says by printing money for distribution to banks. And so I think this is a common misconception, but the Fed actually has no control over the printing of money. That is a power given to the Department of Treasury. And so the Treasury Department is going to be the one who's going to be printing money in regards to into that aspect of the money supply. And so 4 is going to be marked incorrect. 5 says by responding quickly to banking crises that occur. And this is true. We can see this happening now with the Fed's actions after the COVID-19 crisis hit. We can see that in its actions in previous times when there's been banking crises, such as when the 2008 financial crisis happened. And so the Fed is going to do a lot of damage control in most times by just lowering their interest rates for the country, and by lowering those interest rates, that has an effect of softening the blow of any banking crisis that is happening. And so far, that has seemed to work out very well in the banks in the Fed's favor. And so that is something that we would definitely mark as correct. And finally, 6, by auditing banks on current regulations. And again, this is something that is going to be true. The Fed will be involved in making sure that banks are, fulfilling their obligations based on the regulations that the Fed has put in place. And that is something that will be true as well. And so we have, let's see, we have 1, 2, 5, and 6 as what we have marked as correct. And so that's what we're going to be working with as our final answers. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor said, and the previous tutor also said 1, 2, 5, and 6. And they said that central banks regulate and supervise the monetary policy of an economy by governing its commercial banking system. They utilize a number of monetary policy instruments to control the level of credit creation and hence the money supply in the market through the banking industry. The central bank determines what portion of deposits must be kept as cash in the vault of a bank as reserves to cater to the day-to-day withdrawal requirements of depositors. The percentage of reserve requirements divided by 1 gives the money multiplier. The central bank oversees the national payment system and aids commercial banks in cases of the financial crisis, and it also audits banks based on current regulations. Yeah, nothing much to add here, so we're going to say good answer, and we can move on to the next question. Okay, the next question says, Visoro is one of more than 100 perfectly competitive firms in the market it operates. In the following is the market demand curve in the firm's individual demand curve. The demand curve that Visoro faces is identical to which of its other curves, check all that apply. And so on the left-hand side, we have a market demand curve given by supply and demand curves. You have equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. And then because this is a price taker, perfectly competitive firm, on the right-hand side, we have Visoro's demand curve, which is a flat horizontal line at the equilibrium price level. And so that would be perfectly elastic demand. And so the question now is what does this flat line also represent? So the first thing that we can consider is marginal revenue curve. And this is going to be true, right? In this case, because this is a perfectly competitive market, the price is equal to the marginal revenue of every good. If a firm were to sell an additional unit of a good, their marginal revenue would be equal to the price that the consumer paid for that good. And that doesn't change no matter what. And so that perfectly competitive marginal revenue curve is going to be equal to a demand curve for this market. 2 says marginal cost curve, and we're not given any information about costs for this particular firm, and so we cannot say whether or not it is identical to the demand curve, and most of the times it is not. Same goes for the supply curve. We're not given any information about the supply curve for this particular firm, and so we cannot say anything about whether or not it's going to be identical to the other curves. And finally, 4 says average revenue curve, and the average revenue curve is simply a average of total revenue divided by quantity sold. And so looking at the fact that marginal revenue curve is going to be flat at price level, then average revenue curve is obviously going to be equal to the marginal revenue curve and demand curve as well, in that if you take the total revenue you've sold and divided by the quantity you've sold, you simply have the average marginal revenue that you sold each good for, which is constant in this case. And so 1 and 4 are going to be the 2 that we check to be identical to this demand curve. Let's take a look at the previous answer, and the previous answer says also 1 and 4, which is good. And the previous tutor said a perfectly competitive firm consists of a large number of small firms that sell identical products in the market, which can be perfectly substituted for each other. There are absolutely no barriers to entry and exit in such a market, along with perfect mobility within the market space. All these attributes collectively strip away a firm from its bargaining power. It becomes a price taker in the market as an attempt to set a unique price that compels consumers to switch to a firm's competitor. Hence, a perfectly competitive firm's individual demand curve becomes perfectly elastic with a horizontal slope. It is identical to a marginal revenue and average revenue curve of the firm, as both the average revenue and marginal revenue are essentially the price of the good. Yeah, that's good. I was just confused a little bit by this phrasing. But yes, but what the basically is trying to say here is that you're a price taker because if you were to try or an attempt to set a unique price, then people would just stop buying from you. So yeah, this is a good answer, and nothing really needs to be clarified here. Okay, the next question says that when economists say that the demand for a product has decreased, they mean that 1, the product has become particularly scarcer for some reason. 2, the product has become more expensive and thus consumers are buying less of it. 3, consumers are now willing and able to buy less of this product at each possible price. Or 4, the demand curve has shifted to the right. And so again, this goes back to this idea of the distinction between a movement along the demand curve and a shift in the demand curve, right? And which are we talking about here? This is our regular demand curve. If the demand for a product has decreased, we have 2 ways of talking about this. We can say demand for a product has decreased. We can say the quantity demanded for a product has decreased. Quantity demanded for a product simply means that the price has gone up and the quantity demanded has shifted because of the shift in where we are on the demand curve, right? We've gone from here to here. Quantity demand has decreased. When we say that demand for a product has decreased, we mean that at every single price level, the quantity demanded has gone down. So if this is our price level, sorry, that's pretty bad. If this is our price level, whereas before people were buying this much, now they might be buying this much. Whereas this was our previous price level, before people were buying this much, now they might be buying this much. And so if we connect all these points, we see that a decrease in demand for a product means that the entire demand curve has shifted to the left. And so that's what we really want to see in the explanation given in one of these answer choices. So 1 says that the product has become particularly scarcer for some reason, and so that's not going to be the case. Demand is not even implying anything about supply of the product, right? And so that's not going to be the correct answer. 2 says that the product has become more expensive and thus consumers are buying less of it. And again, that's what we would talk about when we say there's a movement along the demand curve, or quantity demanded has changed. Well, here we're saying that demand for the product overall has changed, and so it's not going to be 2. 3 says consumers are now willing and able to buy less of this product at each possible price, and that is going to be something that matches what we were saying, right? At every price level, consumers are buying less of the product. And so 3 is going to be what we think is going to be the right answer, but just to check, let's check number 4. And number 4 says that the demand curve has shifted to the right, and they get the demand shifting part correct, but they get the direction wrong. It should be to the left, not to the right. And so 3 is going to be our best answer here. We can take a look at the previous tutor's answer, and they also chose 3. And we can read what they wrote as well. A decrease in demand is represented by a shift in the demand curve to the left. This shift occurs due to an unfavorable change in factors that influences demand for a good or service other than its own price. It essentially represents that consumers are now willing and able to purchase a lower quantity of that product at each possible price. A decrease in demand occurs due to a decrease in income of the consumer, providing the good is a normal good, an unfavorable change in taste or preferences, a decrease in the price of a substitute good, an increase in the price of a complementary good, and or an increase in aversion for the product due to internal and or external factors. I think that's a great answer, very thorough. I like how we provide different demand determinants to say what might be a cause for this decrease in the overall demand. But yeah, this is a great answer, and we can mark that as correct. Now let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, what do economists mean by the demand for money? What is the disadvantage of holding money? Sorry about that. What is the advantage of money? And what does an increase in interest, why does an increase in the interest rate, decrease the quantity of money demanded? And so here we're very clearly talking about the money market graph. The money market graph is another graph we want to be familiar with. We have quantity of money on the x-axis, we have interest rate on the y-axis, we have our downward sloping demand curve, and then we have our money supply. Right? And so the way this works is that the money supply is a vertical line because there's only one number that represents the overall amount of money in circulation in the economy, right? And that number is going to be Q star or MS. And so it is not something that fluctuates. It's not something that changes based, like the quantity of money does not change based on the interest rate being charged. When we see monetary supply at work, what we're really seeing is shifts in the money supply line, right? So let's say the Fed decides to increase the money supply, what we're really seeing is a shift to the right for money supply. If we're saying the money supply is decreasing, what we're really seeing is a shift to the left in the money supply curve, right? And so that's what we see when we talk about money supply. On the other hand, we also have our demand curve. And so demand curve seems to be much more simple in terms of what we conventionally think of as a demand curve. It's a downward sloping line, a negative relationship between x variable and the y variable. And so why is that the case in this situation? Why is a higher interest rate likely to result in a lower quantity of demand for money, lower demand for money, and why does a low interest rate suggest there would be a higher demand for money? And so the reason is fairly simple, right? If there is a high interest rate, what you're going to see happening is that people are going to be putting most of their money into savings accounts and banking accounts in order to take advantage of the high returns on savings through the interest rates. And so if people are going to be saving more money, they're keeping less money on hand, and therefore the demand for money, which is physically like having cash or bank deposits on hand, is going to be much lower. Similarly, if the interest rate is going to be really low, then there's going to be less people willing to save their money in interest accounts, and more people holding cash on hand, and that is going to be something that is going to lead to a higher quantity of money being demanded. Another way to think about this is from the borrower's perspective. So let's say you're an entrepreneur and you want to borrow money to invest in your own business. If the interest rate is really high, you're going to be less inclined to go and take out a loan, because the high interest rate means that any loan you take out now to pay for or invest in your business is going to require a very high return on when you end up paying back that loan plus interest. Meanwhile, if you're similarly an entrepreneur looking to invest in your own business, you want to take out a loan, and the interest rate is really low, you're going to be more likely to take out a larger amount of loans, because you know that even though you're taking out more money and you're holding more cash and investing that into your own business, the low interest rate means that you pay back very little money on the principal amount that you borrow. And so that's another way of thinking about the negative relationship between demand for money and interest rate. And so let's go back to the question at hand. What do economists mean by demand for money? They mean the demand by investors for, or demand by people to hold cash or demand deposits for either investment purposes or consumption purposes. So the next question says, what is the disadvantage of holding money? And so the biggest disadvantage of holding money is that it returns no interest. Let's say you emptied out your bank account right now and you just kept all that money in a drawer. That money does not earn any interest over time. And so by holding a lot of money, you're foregoing potential interest income if you were to instead invest that money into even a savings account, but also the stock market or mutual funds or other financial assets. On the other hand, there are some advantages, and that goes to the next question, which says, what is the advantage of holding money? And the advantage of holding money is that if you're holding cash, it's very liquid, and so you're very flexible in terms of cash flow. There's no need to move around assets when making purchases, and it's also risk-free. Holding money means that if there's suddenly a complete market crash and the value of financial assets goes down the drain, if you have no financial assets, then that has no effect on you. So it's fairly insulated risk, right? Depending on how you define risk. So there are some advantages. And finally, the last question says, why does an increase in the interest rate decrease the quantity of money demanded? And again, we went over this. You can think about this from the saver's perspective. If there's a high interest rate, I want to save my money. I don't want to hold it, and so there's going to be lower demand. And you can also think of it from the investor's perspective. If there's a high interest rate, I'm not trying to take out a loan at a high interest rate to invest in my business if I know I have to pay that much interest on it. And so that is also going to decrease the quantity of money demanded. So hopefully that answers all those questions. And we can take a look at what the previous tutor has said as well. So the previous tutor says that in economics, the demand for money is the desire to hold financial assets in the form of money, cash or bank deposits, for transactionary, precautionary, and speculative motives. Demand for money, I like how I put that. Demand for money is a downward sloping curve that shows increase in demand with the fall of prices and vice versa. The disadvantage is that money does not earn interest and its value depreciates over time. And the advantage is that cash is the most liquid form of money, and holding it is beneficial because we can readily use it. And finally, with an increase in interest rates, people deposit more money with the bank to earn interest, and therefore money in their hands decreases. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. I think good answer. Answers all the things that were mentioned before, and we can mark that as correct. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So the next question says, which of the following is not a viable monetary policy target for the Fed? A says the inflation rate, B says the interest rate, C says the money supply, and D says the money demand. And so monetary policy can take many forms. We know that, for example, the Fed can engage in open market operations. They can sell or buy treasury bonds, and that is going to affect the money supply. And so C is definitely going to be a viable monetary policy target. That is, in fact, probably the most viable monetary policy target that the Fed is interested in. Similarly, we know that the Fed has control over interest rates. And so, again, the Fed can say there seems to be an economic recession coming on. There's a crisis right now. Let's lower the interest rates so that it softens the blow and increases the ability of investors to take out loans and stuff like that. And so that's, again, also going to be a viable monetary policy target. The inflation rate is tied to money supply in terms of price level. So we know that that's something that the Fed is keenly aware of and also trying to keep in mind when conducting policy. So A, B, and C all seem to be aspects of monetary policy that the Fed is working with pretty directly. D says the money demand, and again, this seems to be more so a aspect of monetary policy that is more so on the consumer side and investor side. It is not something that the Fed has complete control over. It is not something that is determined purely by what the Fed does. There are a lot of factors that go into whether or not demand for money is high or low. And so this is also not something that you often see the Fed saying, well, we want the money demand to be higher, let's do this. We want the money demand to be lower, let's do this. The same way that they might say, we want inflation to be higher, we want inflation to be lower, etc. And so D is going to be the best answer for this question as one of the options which is not a viable monetary policy target for the Fed. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said, as we know, the monetary policy is a policy led by the central bank of the country. The main tools of monetary policy are open market operations, reserve requirements, discount rates, etc. The main targets of monetary policy are divided into three parts known as exchange rate, monetary aggregates, and interest rate. Monetary policy is mainly used by macroeconomic goals like stability, full employment, etc. So we can say that options A, B, and C are the monetary policy target for the Fed. Therefore, option D is the correct option. I mean, I think that's pretty accurate. So we can say good, and we can move on to the next question. So the next question says, if real GDP and aggregate expenditures are less than equilibrium expenditures, firms' inventories blank, so firms blank production and real GDP blanks. So what we have here is a situation we can depict on the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model, right? So we have long run aggregate supply, which is also known as potential GDP. And we say real GDP and aggregate expenditure is less than equilibrium expenditure. So we have a recessionary or contractionary gap. We have demand, we have short run aggregate supply, and we have Q1, which is less than Q star. And so this is our situation, right? We have this recessionary gap. There's real GDP and aggregate expenditure is less than the equilibrium expenditure, which is at long run aggregate supply. So the question is, what happens first to firms' inventories? So if aggregate expenditure is low, then what that means is that not all the things that are being produced by producers is being sold. And so if producers have produced 100 units and only 90 units are sold, the last 10 units don't get disposed of, they get added to firms' inventory for next year. And so firms' inventories are going to go up when we have low aggregate expenditure. So the next question is, okay, so we've established that inventory has increased. We've eliminated, this is a really weird numbering system. We eliminated the first and second answer choices. We're left with the third and fourth. What happens to production then? So if inventories have gone up, that means that firms no longer have a need for production at a high level because they have leftover inventory that they can still sell from previous production cycles. And so the current production that firms go through might decrease as well. So we have firms are going to increase their inventories and decrease their production. Okay, so we haven't eliminated anything else yet. Both 3 and 4 still say decrease for production. So what happens to real GDP? And so it seems to be a very straightforward link to say that if firms are have lower production, then and production is linked to output, then overall output is going to decrease as well. And so we have our final answers should say if real GDP and aggregate expenditure are less than equilibrium expenditure, then firms' inventories increase, so firms decrease production and real GDP decreases. And that's going to match up with answer choice 3. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said, when the aggregate planned expenditure is equal to the real GDP, the economy is said to be operating at the level of equilibrium expenditure. If aggregate expenditures are less than real GDP, it means that all that is being produced is not being consumed. This leads to an increase in firms' inventories. With increasing inventories of unsold units, firms decrease their level of production. As the level of production decreases, the real GDP decreases as well with a decrease in output, and equilibrium is restored in the long run. So this is going to be a good answer choice. I don't believe there's anything missing from this. You can say good answer and move on to the next question. Now, the next question says, which statement best describes how the Fed responds to recessions? So 1 says it sells more securities. 2 says it charges banks more interest. 3 says it increases the money supply. 4 says it increases reserve requirements. And so, again, the Fed is interested in, shortening the length of recessions and getting to recovery or expansion more quickly. So it's going to do anything it can to counteract the effect of a recession. So one important way it's going to do that is to try and it's going to want to increase aggregate demand, right? A recession is often characterized by a fall in aggregate demand. And so how can the Fed, through monetary policy, increase aggregate demand? And the thing that the Fed can affect that was most directly tied to aggregate demand is going to be to change the interest rate. So is it going to want to increase the interest rate or decrease the interest rate? And we talked about how a low interest rate stimulates investment spending, because a low interest rate means that people are going to be more willing to take out loans and spend that money either on consumption or spend that money on creating business or production. And so we would see that a lower interest rate is going to be the direction we want the interest rate to go in order to stimulate aggregate demand to respond to this recession. So the next question says, okay, we want to increase aggregate demand, which means we want to lower interest rate. Let me write this. out for us so we can make sure we're on the same page. We want to increase aggregate demand, and to do that, we want to decrease interest rates, right? And so what's the thing that we can do to decrease interest rates? And that's going to go back to the money supply graph. Let's see if I can get this a little bit more clearly drawn out. Interest rate on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x-axis, demand for money here, money supply here. How can we decrease the interest rates? Right now our interest rate is going to be at this equilibrium point. How do we get to an interest rate lower than I star, right? And the answer is simply shift the money supply to the right. If we shift the money supply to the right, we reach a new equilibrium point, and that is going to be a lower interest rate, right? We see interest rate has gone down. And so we know that the next step is actually going to be to increase the money supply. So now finally we get to the tools that the Fed has to try and increase the money supply. First answer choice says to sell more securities. If the Fed sells more securities, it's engaging in what is known as open market operations. Selling securities is going to give or push securities onto the market, right? You're selling securities, people are buying your securities. You're giving people securities and you're taking money from them. And that's in effect decrease the money supply. You've put securities into circulation, you've taken money out of circulation. That's going to decrease the amount of money in circulation. So that is going to be counterproductive to what we want to accomplish here. So it's not going to be 1. 2 says that it charges banks more interest. And if you charge banks more interest, what's that going to do? It's going to decrease borrowing by banks, it's going to decrease the circulation of money through commercial banks, and that's also going to decrease the money supply. So it's not going to be 2 as well. 3 says to increase the money supply, and that's not a tool, that's just a result, but yeah, if we can increase the money supply, that would solve our problems, and so 3 seems to be a great answer. And finally 4 says it increases reserve requirements, and if you're increasing reserve requirements, you're requiring banks, commercial banks, to hold more of their deposits in reserve and loan out less money. And that effect decreases the money multiplier and results in a decrease in the money supply. So that is going to be our final answer. It's going to be answer choice 3. The Fed is going to try and increase the money supply. And hopefully it makes sense. We want the aggregate demand to go up, so we want interest rates to go down, so we want money supply to go up. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they also said it increases the money supply. And the previous tutor says, when an economy is undergoing a period of recession due to plummeting profitability of markets arising from low aggregate demand, the Federal Reserve attempts to enhance the spending capacity of consumers to increase aggregate demand and rescue the economy from recession. To increase the level of aggregate demand in the market, the Fed increases the money supply. Selling securities is a part of contractionary monetary policy targeted at reducing the amount of money held by consumers. Charging a higher rate of interest compromises the credit creation capacity of commercial banks that reduces the money supply in the market and decreases the level of aggregate demand. Increasing reserve requirements does the same as it reduces the pool of deposits available to banks for extending loans. So I think this is a good reasoning for why the other answer choices are wrong. Let's add a reasoning for why this answer choice is right. If there is a recession, the Fed will want to stimulate / increase aggregate demand. To do that, it will attempt to lower the interest rate in order to stimulate investment and consumption spending. The Fed can accomplish this goal by increasing the money supply, which would result in a new equilibrium in the money market graph and a lower interest rate. So that is going to be the correct solution. Let's take a look at the next question. Next question says, in moving along a stable demand curve, which of the following is not held constant? 1 says the prices of substitute goods. 2 says the prices of complementary goods. 3 says consumer incomes. 4 says price expectations. 5 says the price of the product for which the demand curve is relevant. And so what we're again looking at here is this distinction between the movement along the demand curve and the shift of the demand curve. If you're moving along a stable demand curve, then the only thing that causes changes is changes in price, right? Everything else is held constant. Any demand determinants is going to be something that shifts the demand curve overall. And so if we're not talking about shifts, then all demand determinants must be held constant. And demand determinants include the prices of substitute goods, the prices of complementary goods, consumer incomes, price expectations. All those things are demand determinants. And so all 4 of those things are going to be held constant. And then finally, we get to answer choice 5, the price of the product for which the demand curve is relevant. And it doesn't make sense for that to be held constant because we're literally depicting a relationship between price and quantity demanded, right? We have quantity here, price here. This is our demand curve. The movement along the demand curve is inherently going to change the price of the product for which this demand curve is relevant. And so this being held constant makes no sense because it's counterproductive to the idea of what a demand curve represents. And so 5 is going to be the right answer choice here. The price of the product for which the demand curve is relevant will not be held constant. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So they also chose 5. And they said that when we move along a stable demand curve, the price of the product continuously changes. Movement along a demand curve indicates change in the quantity demanded with respect to changes in price, ceteris paribus. All other factors that influence demand, such as the price of related goods, i.e. substitutes and complements, the expectations of consumers, their incomes and preferences, etc., are kept constant along the demand curve, for changes in these factors lead to a change in the entire demand, which shifts the curve in a parallel direction. So yeah, this is a good answer. Very clear. You can mark that as correct. So now, next question says, the primary difference between absolute and comparative advantage is that absolute advantage refers to the ability to produce more of a good or service using the same amount of resources, and comparative advantage refers to the ability to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost. B says absolute advantage refers to the ability to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost, and comparative advantage refers to the ability to produce more of a good or service using the same amount of resources. 3 says absolute advantage is a concept that was utilized in communist countries, and comparative advantage is a capitalist idea. And 4 says absolute advantage can never change, while comparative advantage depends on the relative cost of a good's resources. And so looking at the definitions, 1 seems to directly encompass the 2 definitions of absolute and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage refers to the ability of somebody or some party to produce more of a good or service given the same amount of resource. And comparative advantage refers to the ability to produce that resource at a lower opportunity cost. That's the big difference. And so 1 is going to be the best answer here. And this is really just a definition-based question. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They also said 1. And they said that the theory of absolute advantage was proposed by Adam Smith as a basis of international trade. This theory suggests that an economic entity possesses an absolute advantage in the production of a good or service if it can produce a greater quantity of the same using the same amount of resources. A greater output with the same amount of inputs gives an absolute advantage. The theory of comparative advantage, however, does not compare the output generated or the input used explicitly. It measures the opportunity cost of a production activity, determine the comparative advantage of a producer. Simply put, an economic entity is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of a good or service if it can produce the same at a lower opportunity cost compared to its competitors. Yeah, great answer. Good distinction. Nothing to add there. Let's move on to the next question. So the next question said, a tax on labor income blank, the equilibrium quantity of labor blank. And so we can see that in choice A says, or 1 says, decreases the supply of labor and increases the demand for labor and increases. 2 says that it decreases the supply of labor, increases the demand for labor, and decreases. 3 says it decreases the demand for labor and decreases. And 4 says it decreases the supply of labor and decreases. So again, we're dealing here with the labor market. And so let's draw that out. We have on the x-axis quantity of labor. On the y-axis, we have wages offered. On the demand curve is given by employers, and the supply curve is given by laborers or labor marketers. So what happens when we have a tax on labor income? Who does that affect? Does it affect employees or employers? And so tax on labor income, aka income tax, is going to be something that is going to affect the employees, right? Employees that used to take home all of their wages, 100% of their wages, and now a certain percentage of those wages goes to the government instead of into the pockets of the people. And so that's going to be something that is going to decrease the supply of labor, because effectively the effective wage rate has gone down as a result of the tax. So that's going to result in a leftward shift. Come on. Yeah. A leftward shift in supply. We go from S star to S1. And so let's take a look at which of these answer choices is going to really characterize this shift for the first part of the question. One says decreases the supply of labor, which is true, but then the other part of one says it increases the demand for labor. And there's no evidence, or there's no reason to suggest that demand is going to go up as a result of a labor income tax. So we're not going to pick number one. Two says decreases the supply of labor and increases the demand for labor. And again, we don't have evidence, or we don't have any reason to suggest that demand is affected by a late income tax, and so 2 is not going to be correct. 3 says it decreases the demand for labor, but again, we know we're talking about the supply side, not the demand side of labor, and we're left with D, decrease the supply of labor. So that seems already to be our best answer choice. We can move on to the next part of the question, which says the equilibrium quantity of labor increases or decreases, and we can see that the quantity of labor has gone down. It used to be at Q star, now it's at Q1, right? And so that's going to be a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor. And so 4 is going to be our best answer here. A tax on labor income is going to decrease the supply of labor, and the equilibrium quantity of labor decreases as well. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor says, a tax on labor income reduces the incentive to work, as workers realize that much of what they earn will be exhausted in the payment of taxes, and a relatively smaller amount will be available as disposable income. This reduces the opportunity cost of leisure and hence will induce workers to value leisure more than before. A says, a reduction in the supply of labor due to an increase or imposition of taxes will shift the supply curve to the left, and hence the equilibrium quantity of labor will decrease. So that seems to be a good answer choice, very thorough. Nothing for us to modify in there. Next question says, how does the demand curve faced by a purely monopolistic seller differ from that confronting a purely competitive firm? Why does it differ? Of what significance is the difference? Why is a pure monopolist demand curve not perfectly inelastic? So what we can do here is we can look up, or we can just draw out the difference between these two firms' demand curves. So for a perfectly competitive firm, they're a price-taking firm. So, this is going to be the demand curve, and it's set by the equilibrium price in the market, right? There's nothing that is really allowing this firm to differentiate themselves in any way. There's nothing that is allowing this firm to have any market power to control price, so they're going to have a flat demand curve. Meanwhile, for a monopolist, they're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. It's given by D. They're going to have a marginal revenue curve that's also downward sloping, and then they're going to have maybe a supply curve like this, right? So like price and quantity. And so this is the difference between the two. So the first question says, how does the demand curve faced by a purely monopolistic seller differ from that confronting a purely competitive firm? Again, the difference is that a purely competitive firm has a flat demand curve, and a purely monopolistic seller is going to have a downward sloping demand curve. Next question is, why does it differ? And it's different because of a difference in market power. With perfect competition, you have thousands of identical sellers selling the exact same product with no ability to differentiate, and so there's no chance for a firm who wants to set a price of their own as a price setter because if they were to deviate away from the market price, they would immediately lose all of their market share to other people, right? If they wanted to increase their price even by a little bit, there's no reason for people to buy from this seller and not one of the other thousands of identical sellers selling the exact same product. And so that's why the demand curve is a flat curve for the perfectly competitive firm, because it's a price taker. Meanwhile, the monopoly curve is going to be downward sloping because the monopoly is a price setter. It's got complete control of the market. It can afford to set the price at whatever level it really wants to, and so that's going to give us a lot more flexibility in determining the price level for a monopoly firm. The next question says, of what significance is the difference? And the significance is simply that the consumer really gets the big difference is the ability to set prices, right? Like the perfectly competitive firm, again, has no ability to set prices, and so it really just has to take whatever the market can get. If the firm faces very high cost curves, then it would be unfortunate. They would have an inability to really maintain their presence in that market. Meanwhile, a monopoly has much more control over how much it wants to charge and what level of revenue they want to earn. And so that difference allows them a more flexible range of pricing options. And the final question is, why is the pure monopolist demand curve not perfectly inelastic? And so, again, the difference between these two firms is mostly in market power. In terms of elasticity, that really, again, is just going to depend on the revenue. Well, that's going to really depend on the particular product at hand and the consumers. The demand curve for the monopolist is downward sloping and not perfectly inelastic for the same reason any other demand curve might be downward sloping and not perfectly inelastic, because the law of demand holds in that when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And it's not a situation in which consumers deem this good to be so important or necessary, or for some other reason independent, quantity demanded would be independent of price level. And that's the main reason. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So the previous tutor said, monopolist is a single seller. He has the freedom to charge a higher or lower price. With a change in price, the quantity demanded also alters. The monopolist himself is the firm and industry. Because of this, the demand curve for monopolist is downward sloping. In a perfectly competitive market, individuals are price takers, and the price is determined by the intersection of the market supply and demand curves. The demand curve for an individual firm is different from a market demand curve. The market demand curve is downward sloping, whereas the firm's demand curve is horizontal. It indicates a price elasticity of demand that is elastic. The demand curve for an individual firm is equal to the equilibrium price of the market. There are no perfectly inelastic demand curves. The demand curve for a monopolist product or service is downward sloping. What we can make no statement about how elastic or inelastic it is. Yeah, so nothing really much to add here. So good answer, and we can move on to the next question. Next question says, what would likely happen if the government increased payroll taxes? Again, this goes back to one of the previous tutor questions that we talked about when we said that what would be the impact of the introduction of income tax. So if we were to increase payroll taxes, the same thing that happens on this graph would occur. So let's take a look at the answer choices. 1 says retirees would discover they have fewer benefits than they'd anticipated. 2 says citizens would have to wait for longer to collect their benefits. 3 says that workers would have less money to take home each week. And 4 says government officials would please everyone involved. So for number 1, retirees would discover they have fewer benefits than they'd anticipated. That seems to be talking about Social Security benefits. Payroll taxes are talking about income tax, which has to do if you're currently working. Social Security benefits has to do if you're retired and you're taking away from Social Security. And so those are two different things, and one would not be the correct answer here. 2 says that citizens would have to wait far longer to collect their benefits. Again, this is something that seems to have to do with Social Security benefits, not payroll taxes, so we're not going to do anything with that. 3 says that workers would have less money to take home each week, and this seems to be true. If you increase your income tax level, then more money goes to the government, less money goes to workers, and so workers would take home less money each week. That seems to be the best answer. 4 says government officials would please everyone involved. I think most people would be unhappy if the payroll taxes were to increase, and so 3 is going to be the best answer here. What would most likely happen if the government increased payroll taxes? Workers would have less money to take home each week. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They also said 3. And they said that payroll taxes are taxes imposed as a percentage of salaries that workers receive. They can either be directly deducted from the wage before received by the employee, or they can be paid explicitly by the employee once he or she receives his or her wage. If the government increases payroll taxes, the percentage of income paid by workers as taxes will also increase, and workers will take less money home each week. At the same time, the increase in taxes will reduce the incentive to work. Both of those are true. This is a good explanation, and nothing much that we really want to add here. Next question says that the cost of fuel is on the rise. In what way will this affect global trade? 1 says exchange rates will decrease, 2 says quotas will increase, 3 says shipping expenses will increase, and 4 says tariffs will decrease. So the thing what we're talking about with global trade is always transaction costs, right? And also foreign trade policy. So it's unclear how a rise in the cost of fuel is going to directly affect exchange rates. Maybe in some way we can predict a general fluctuation, but there's no direct impact. 2 says that quotas will increase. And again, it's unclear how a change in the cost of fuel is going to change the limit that some countries are going to impose on how much they can import certain products. Those seem to be 2 independent things. 3 says that shipping expenses will increase, and this is going to be true. We might travel by plane, but in terms of shipping goods, goods are, for the most part, mostly transported through shipping, and so that's something that requires a lot of fuel. And if we were to have a rise in the cost of fuel, then the transaction costs of shipping goods between countries is going to increase drastically, and so that will have impacts on global trade. Just to make sure that 3 is going to be the right answer, we'll go to 4. And 4 says tariffs will decrease. And again, it seems unclear exactly why changing fuel prices is going to impact trade policy by certain countries. It just doesn't seem clear to me why the link would exist between those 2 things. And so 3 was going to be the best answer here. If the cost of fuel is on the rise, shipping expenses will increase. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And they also said 3. And they said that fuel is one of the fundamental propellants of the global economy. Various manufacturing and service sectors that stand on the availability and accessibility to fuel. If cost of fuel is increasing, quantity supply will decrease. Conversely, the cost of fuel can be on the rise due to a decrease in supply that shifts the supply curve to the left. The increase in the cost of fuel will lead to a subsequent increase in shipping expenses, i.e. an increase in the cost of transportation for almost all goods and services. Yeah, I think the end takeaway for that is good. Good takeaway. That's all you'd have to know. When we ship things, it costs fuel, and if fuel is expensive, then shipping costs rise. Okay, next question. Next question says, any model is based on making assumptions because of what? And so the reason in any model that we're talking about, you'll often hear the words ceteris paribus thrown around, and that just means holding all else equal, and that's an assumption, is because that economists want to understand economic concepts through models, and the only way we can do that is to build very controlled environments or models in which you can isolate changes in certain things to a set of specific variables, rather than in the real world, where if you wanted to, there's no model that simulates the real world because there's so many things happening in the real world that can affect the results of a theoretical model. And so holding things constant and making assumptions is going to allow economists to simplify their depiction of real-world events in order to better understand specific things that are of importance to global macroeconomic or microeconomic understanding. And so that's going to be the main reason. Let's take a look at the previous tutoring answer. This is pretty open-ended, so there's not necessarily a 100% right answer. So previous tutor said that any model is based on making assumptions because models must be simplified for their efficient and productive utilization. Economic theories can be tested for accuracy only in the real-world environments or situations that mimic those. Treating the world like a laboratory is not possible as various factors are beyond human control in nature. The risk of danger is also very high. Hence, economic models are created based on various assumptions for successful testing and derivations of economic phenomena. Economic models are theoretical constructs that describe economic phenomena through a set of variables, both endogenous and exogenous in nature, and the interaction between them which describes their quantitative relationship. It is a simplified framework based on mathematics or logic supported by empirical evidence to illustrate complex systems and explain the occurrence of different economic situations. Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying that the real world is complicated and we need to simplify it in order to understand certain economic phenomena. Good answer. Oops, the caps lock's on. Good. Come on. Good. Oh, why is it all? Okay, well, I guess we're doing all capitalized today. Good answer. Okay, and let's move on to these questions. So the first question here says, all of the following statements apply to a purely competitive market in the long run except which of the following? So A says, in the long run, all inputs are variable in quantity. B says, firms can expand their plant capacities in the long run. C says, total fixed costs remain constant even when output expands in the long run. And D says, firms may enter or leave the industry in the long run. So let's go down this list and see if we can say which one of these are true or false. So A says, in the long run, all inputs are variable in quantity. That is true. The difference between the short run and the long run is that the short run assumes certain fixed costs can't be changed. In the long run assumes that there's no such thing as fixed costs, that all costs can be changed. So A is going to be true. B says that firms can expand their plant capacities in the long run. Again, that is true. Plant capacity might be a limiting factor in the short run. In the long run, we again assume everything is variable. So you can totally expand your plant capacity if you want to in the long run. C says total fixed costs remain constant even when output expands in the long run. And so that seems to be something that is not true. Total fixed costs are going to be variable in the long run because if you expand output in the long run, then you might have higher fixed costs, etc. And similarly, you might experience economies of scale or something like that actually decreases your costs. So C seems to be something that is not true. And D says firms may enter or leave the industry in the long run. And again, that is also true. If you make in the long run, if you're making negative economic profit, then you might want to leave the industry. If you're making positive economic profit, you're going to incentivize more firms to enter this industry to gain that profit. And so C is going to be the best answer here. Let's take a look at the previous answer. In the long run, perfect competition, all variables and hence costs are variable in the firm and nothing is fixed. Therefore, option C, or total fixed cost remains constant even when output expands in the long run, is the right answer. Great, we're all in agreement. Next question says 2. Which of the following is true of normal profits? A says they are necessary to keep a firm in the industry in the long run. B says they are zero under pure competition in the long run. C says they are excluded from a firm's cost of production. And D says they are what attracts other firms to enter an industry. So normal profits essentially assumes that including your economic profit is zero. Right. There again is a distinction between economic profit and accounting profit because economic profit accounts for opportunity costs, but that's the central gist of it. So A says that they are necessary. That normal profits are necessary to keep a firm in the industry in the long run, and this is true. If a firm is not making normal profits and they're making negative profits, then they simply cannot operate in the long run because they would be continually losing money. And so A is definitely going to be something that is going to be true. B says they are zero under pure competition in the long run. Again, this is confusing. I think it's unclear what zero refers to, but if we assume that there's a distinction between well, there is a distinction between accounting profit and normal profits. And if they're talking about accounting profits, then it's not necessarily true that they need to be zero, right? Under pure competition, they could be positive accounting profits and zero economic profit, and that would be true. But if without that clarification, it's unclear at this point. C said they are excluded from a firm's cost of production. It's again, profits are not a cost of, they're not an input cost, and they're not something that we consider when doing production, and so it's unclear why you would want to be excluding normal profits from the cost of production, so that's not going to be true. And D says they are what attract other firms to enter an industry, and it's actually going to be positive economic profit that attracts other firms to enter industry, so greater than normal profits. And so with just normal profits, there's no real incentive for other firms who are not yet in the industry to enter that industry because there's no positive profits for them to take a piece of. So A seems to be the best answer here. And we could take a look at the next question. At the previous year's answer. So the previous year says, normal profits constitute the minimum amount of earnings necessary for the firm to exist in the market and not shut down. It is a measure of the opportunity cost of the resources available to the firm that is necessary for their survival in the market. Hence, option A, they are necessary to keep a firm in the industry in the long run, is the correct answer. Great. Let's move on to question number 3. Question 3 says that the long-run supply curve would be perfectly elastic when A, an increase in demand does not cause a change in product price. B, an increase in demand causes an increase in product price. C, a decrease in demand causes an increase in short-run supply. C, a decrease in demand causes an increase in short-run supply. Or D, a decrease in demand causes an increase in product price. So let's take a look at what this graph is normally going to look like. So if we have a long-run supply curve that is perfectly elastic, we have price here, quant here, perfectly elastic. Oops. Okay, assume this is horizontal. For some reason, I can't. Okay. I think my keyboard is messing up right now. Let's just assume this is perfectly, let me see if I can rotate this. Yeah, assume that's perfectly flat. Then if we have a demand curve here, right? This is our demand curve, this is our supply curve. Which of these is going to happen, right? An increase in demand does not cause a change in product price. So an increase in demand shifts demand to the right. We have a new demand curve. And again, we see how the price does not change. The price stays constant at P star. So it seems like A is already the right answer. B says the increase in demand causes an increase in product price. We know that's not the case. We know that no change in demand is going to cause a price change. C says a decrease in demand causes an increase in short-run supply. Again, supply is not changing as a result of demand. And D says a decrease in demand causes an increase in product price. And we know that demand changes are not going to affect price when you have a perfectly elastic supply curve. So it looks like A is going to be the best answer here. The long-run supply curve would be perfectly elastic when an increase in demand does not cause a change in product price. And 3 says the long-run supply curve would be perfectly elastic when usually the firms are confronted with a constant cost structure or when the market price is very much inflexible or remains the same over all levels of output produced and is equal to a minimum average cost. Thus, option A, or an increase in demand, does not cause a change in product price, is the correct answer. Okay, great. Let's go to question 4. What happens in a decreasing cost industry when some firms leave and the industry's output contracts? A says the average cost will increase. B says the average cost will decrease. C, it looks like the third answer choice says the total cost will decrease. And the last answer choice says the product price will decrease. So what happens when some firms leave and output contracts, right? What we're seeing is a leftward shift in supply. The overall supply is left because there's not as many suppliers in the market. In that sense, what's going to happen is you have a new equilibrium point that is at a higher price level. And we know that price in a decreasing cost industry is going to be equal to the minimum point of average total cost. So if the price has gone up, and that means if the equilibrium price has gone up, that means the average cost will have gone up as well. And that means A was going to be the right answer here. What happens in the decreasing cost industry when some firms leave and the industry's output contracts is that average cost will increase. And so A is going to be the right answer here. So let's take a look at the previous answer choice. And the previous tutor said, as firms leave the market and the industry output contracts, the market price will rise as well due to reduced production, and the average cost will also expectedly increase as at equilibrium, the firms operate at the point where price is equal to long-run average cost. Therefore, option A, or the average cost will increase, is the right answer. Great. So let's move on to answer choice question 5. Which of the following statements about a perfectly competitive firm is correct? A says to maximize profits, a competitive firm should produce at that output at which total revenue is greatest. B says in long-run equilibrium, a competitive firm will produce at the point of minimum average costs. C says a competitive firm will produce in the short run so long as total receipts are sufficient to cover total fixed costs. And D says a competitive firm will close down in the short run whenever price is less than the minimum attainable average total cost. Now let's go down the line. A says to maximize profits, a competitive firm should produce at that output at which total revenue is greatest. And so this is going to be kind of a different way of phrasing what the profit maximization rule would be for a perfect competitive firm. Conventionally, we say that to maximize profits, a competitive firm should produce at that output at which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, not at which total revenue is greatest. And so we're going to put that one on the back burner for now and see if any of the other answer choices are going to be better. B says in long-run equilibrium, a competitive firm will produce at the minimum of average costs, and this is true, right? Price is going to be equal to minimum AC or ATC in the long run, and that's going to be a good answer choice. Let's take a look at the other ones. C says a competitive firm will produce in the short run so long as total receipts are sufficient to cover total fixed costs. That's not going to be the case, right? The competitive firm will produce in the short run so long as total receipts are sufficient are greater, so long as marginal revenue is greater than variable costs, right? So much that production is going to in some way lessen the overall costs that you're producing. It doesn't matter if it's greater than recovering overall fixed costs, as long as each unit that you're producing is making positive economic profit, right? And so C is not going to be the correct answer. D says a competitive firm will close down in the short run whenever price is less than a minimum attainable average total cost. And again, we say a competitive firm is only going to shut down in the short run when the price is less than the minimum average variable cost, right? The average variable cost is what we care about because the difference between variable cost and price is how much marginal profit you're making. If marginal profit is negative, then you might as well stop producing overall because every unit that you produce is losing you even more and more money. So a competitive firm will shut down in the short run depending on whether price is greater than or less than the minimum average variable cost, not average total cost. So D is not going to be correct. So it looks like answer choice B is going to be the best answer choice here. Which of the following statements about a competitive firm is correct? B says in long-run equilibrium, a competitive firm will produce the minimum of average costs. So that's going to be our best answer here. So 5 says, in the long run, a perfectly competitive firm will produce the point where price is equal to the minimum of long-run average cost, which will determine the equilibrium quantity for the firms in the long run. Thus, only option B, or in long-run equilibrium, a competitive firm will produce at the point of minimum average costs, is the right answer. Let's go to 6. When there's allocative efficiency in a purely competitive market for a firm or for a product, the minimum price producers are willing to accept is A, less than marginal benefit, B, greater than marginal cost, C, equal to the amount of efficiency or deadweight losses, or D, equal to the maximum price consumers are willing to pay. So, there's the important term to understand here is what is allocative efficiency, right? And allocative efficiency essentially refers to a point in which producers are producing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so that's going to be the profit maximizing point for producers. It's going to be a point which maximizes total efficiency to the economy. And so allocative efficiency is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, aka equilibrium. And so the question is, what is the minimum price producers are willing to accept when you have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? And the reason we know this is equilibrium is because the minimum price producers are willing to accept is going to be equal to the maximum willingness to pay by consumers. And that's why we can settle on this point as the allocatively efficient point, because of that equivalence between those two producer and consumer prices. It's not going to be A, because if the price is less than marginal benefit, we wouldn't be allocatively efficient. And it's not going to be B, because if the price is greater than marginal cost, we again would not be allocatively efficient. It's not going to be C, because efficiency and deadweight loss is area on the curve, on the graph, whereas the minimum price producers are willing to accept is on the y-axis, and so those units don't even match up. So D is going to be the best answer here. When there's allocative efficiency in a purely competitive market for a product, the minimum price producers are willing to accept is equal to the maximum price consumers are willing to pay, and that's going to be our final answer. So let's go to a previous tutor's answer. The previous tutor says, allocative efficiency implies that when the firm produces the profit maximizing output where price is equal to marginal cost, it also means that the economic benefits of consumers measured by the willingness to pay the maximum price for any product is ideally equal to the cost of producing an additional unit of that particular product or marginal cost. Therefore, option D, or equal to the maximum price consumers are willing to pay, is the course. C, sell its new product exclusively for a set number of years, or D, be the exclusive distributor of a particular imported product. So again, a patent is a legal right granted by the government to a firm that owns the patent, and a patent conveys a certain number of rights. It conveys exclusive right to distribute, exclusive right to derivative works, exclusive right to distribute, exclusive right to license this product out and profit off this product. And so in that sense, C is going to be the best answer here, right? A patent does not allow, so A says a patent allows a firm to make copies of other firms' products, and that's not true. That would be patent infringement if the other firm has patents, and so that's not what a patent grants the right to do. B says be the sole buyer of a particular product or resource, and a patent is given to a producer, not to a consumer, and so patents more so are relevant to the ability to sell a product rather than to buy a product, so it's not going to be B. C says to sell his product exclusively for a set number of years. That is true. In the United States, the length of a patent is usually 20 years. And D says be the exclusive distributor of a particular imported product. And so, again, patents are not done with imported products. If you own a patent, it's likely because you invented the product unless you bought the patent from somebody else. And so it has really nothing to do with importing of foreign products. And so C is going to be the best answer here. A patent is a legal right granted to a firm that allows it to sell its new product exclusively for a set number of years. Looking at the previous tutor's answer, they said, a patent commonly implies an official legal right or license granted to an individual agency to manufacture, sell, and invent any new idea or product good for a fixed time period, hence option C, or sell its new product exclusively for a set number of years is the right answer. There's a little bit of it's not a right to invent an idea, right? Most of the time, if you're granted a patent, you've already invented it, but largely the idea is captured there, so we can say that's good. So other than that, looks like we're all in agreement about this question, and so we can move on to the next. I don't think there's actually any questions left. Let me see. So we say good answers. We mark that as correct, and I believe that actually might be all we have for today. Yeah, it is. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. We went over some pretty commonly asked questions, and hope everybody's staying happy and healthy these days. I'll see you guys on Thursday.